Hey everyone. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the Yiddish Policemen's Union by Michael Chabon, and I don't actually have it with me because I got rid of it after I finished reading it because I didn't like it that much. It wasn't terrible, but I'm just trying to get rid of books after I read them if I don't love them, and I didn't love it. So this video might be a little bit shorter than my last two just because I don't have as much to say about it. I guess I'll start by just explaining like the world of it because it's kind of confusing. So this is like a book that takes place in an alternative reality. So in the book, instead of Israel getting founded and taken over, instead of that happening, what happens in this timeline is that the United States sort of creates this quasi like temporary homeland for the Jewish people in Sitka, Alaska, against the will of the indigenous people that are already there. And it's not a permanent homeland, but they don't specify when that time period is going to end. And so the Jewish people end up establishing almost like an Israel size and scale homeland in Alaska. And so that's like the reality that this is taking place. And the city's really big, and it has like these different sections, and there's some people that live there that are more strictly religious, like Hasidic, and then there's some people there that are more ethnically Jewish and wouldn't consider themselves really religiously Jewish. And so it's all taking place in that world, and also in this world, at the time where we're placed into this world, the United States has decided, okay, now it's time to end their temporary stay there. But it's like after decades and decades and decades of them living there, and they've established this whole city and this whole way of life, and now the United States is like, you have to leave. And so they're all trying to figure out where to go, and they're panicking. And so that's like the moment that we're dropped into the story. So that's just like some background of what's going on. The world building of where they live is very cool. It's sort of like run down, and like it has this vibe that it used to be thriving, but it's just kind of like this forgotten place. And it also has like a very it's like a weird place to found a homeland, like in a very cold and somewhat random place for them to be. So there's like all these weird confluences of cultures happening in the world. Also in the background, which is mostly not brought to the forefront except for a few parts, is the conflict that they have with the tension with the indigenous people, because again, the United States in this version of reality basically do what happened with Israel, where they take something from indigenous people that were there and are like, oh, okay, Jewish people that need a homeland, you should take this from the indigenous people, even though we don't have a right to be giving it to you, and people already live there. And so there's sort of like a tension there that's mostly in the background for most of the story, but then it comes to the forefront sort of at the end. So anyway, so that's like that's the setting. And then the story itself it's actually like almost like a CD20s-y feeling detective novel. So our main character is a detective. It's definitely propaganda. He's definitely supposed to be the hero, but he's like one of those like rugged anti-hero detective guys. So he's like an alcoholic. He's like, things aren't working out with his wife. They got a divorce, and now he's kind of a loser, and he's supposed to be a loser, and he like lives in this seedy motel and chain smokes cigarettes, and he doesn't sleep enough, but he's like really committed to being a good detective. So he's like our main character, and then there's a murder in the hotel, and so that's sort of like how the book starts. And then as he's trying to solve the murder, you get introduced to some of these other really important side characters. One is this guy Burko, who's half indigenous and half Jewish, and he's also a detective, and he's actually got his life together. He's married and has a bunch of kids and seems like happy and just like a healthy person. And they work really well together. Like, their relationship with each other is very sweet. There's like a lot of platonic love between the two of them that's fun to read. And his wife, who's a minor character in it, is pretty cool too. And then the other sort of major sidekick character is actually his ex-wife, because she comes back from being somewhere else and she becomes his new boss. And so besides the fact that this is a detective novel, it's also a romance. There's a lot happening in this book. So it's also definitely a romance. And the romance was actually pretty great. I wasn't expecting that it was going to be a romance, but the ex-wife character, her name is Bina, she's probably my favorite part of the book. He did a really good job making her just a very interesting character to read. And their relationship with each other and how they sort of end up falling back in love is very believable, and it's really cute. And I was actually really impressed because the main character he's kind of a sexist, or I don't know if he's a sexist really, actually, but he definitely thinks his ex-wife is really hot. And so there's a bunch of scenes where he's sort of like distractedly staring at her breasts without even really noticing that that's what he's doing. And I think that it's very hard to write a scene like that and not make it like straight male gazy, or like overly describe in a objectifying way the woman's body. But especially for a male author, but I was very impressed because Michael Chabon manages to very realistically just talk about how somebody would think about somebody that they're attracted to without it being objectifying or demeaning. And so that was really impressive, and honestly cute to read. So that was nice. My favorite parts of the book were like the character development was outstanding in this book. That being said, the overall plot of the book was, I don't know, I just thought it was weird. I was definitely locked into like, okay, the person who's murdered, why was he murdered, who murdered him, right? And I was surprised by what the answer to that is, but I don't know if it worked as a detective novel. So basically, I'll give the spoilers now of like what happens, but essentially what happens is that the Hasidic Jews, like the more fervently religious Jewish people in this town, are involved in like underground crime. They're basically like a mafia also. And the head rabbi, who's also the Don of the mafia, right? He has a son, and the son is maybe the Messiah. There's a word for it, but I forget what the word is, but he might be the Messiah. They think he might be the Messiah. Supposedly, there's a possible Messiah born into every generation. They think this might be him. He seems to be able to perform miracles. But then it turns out that he is gay, and so he gets pushed out of the family, and then he ends up struggling with addiction, and then he ends up murdered. All of that background stuff we don't know right away when we discover that he's murdered. Those things are revealed as they do their detective work. But so then you spend all this time thinking like, okay, well, who murdered him and why, right? Because at this point, most people had forgotten about him. He was like struggling with his addiction and living in isolation in a crappy hotel. So it seemed weird that someone would even want to murder him. So the answer to who murdered him is bizarre. The plot of the story is that since they're being kicked out of where they're living by the United States government, they're trying to figure out new places to go, and most of them are spreading out all over the world. But there is a smaller group of people, well-funded, mafia-tied individuals, religious zealots, not just Jewish people, but there's also Christians involved. And they want to establish Israel, actual Israel that exists in our reality. And so they're trying to figure out how to get rid of, how to get rid of the mosque that is quote unquote in the way of their holy place, and violently take over Palestine and turn it into Israel. And in order to do this plot to violently create Israel, they have this plan, which is all based on religious text, which is that they're gonna kidnap the Messiah and sort of trick him into going to the new Israel, so that other people will follow him there and establish and colonize this new Israel. And also, they find this red cow, which I guess is like a really important religious symbol in the Old Testament, and so they find this red cow, and so they're like, okay, with the combination of the red cow and the Messiah, we'll be able to convince people to go with us and establish this new Israel. But then, so they start this plan, right? They kidnap the Messiah, who, like I said, is struggling with addiction, was kicked out of his family because he's gay. They trick him into going to what he thinks is a recovery place, like a rehab. But when he gets there, he realizes that it's not really rehab. It's this weird military training facility that these guys are using to train people up to go establish violently the new Israel. And so he's like, no, I want nothing to do with this. I need to leave. But he knows too much at this point. That's why he ends up getting murdered. They kill him because he knows too much about what's going on. So that's sort of like the whodunit of the story, which was interesting, and I wasn't expecting it, right? Like, I guess the point of a murder is like a murder mystery. One of the marks of whether or not it's good is, did you know who the killer was? And no, I wasn't expecting that to be the ending of the book. But it sort of felt like it came out of nowhere. Or not like it came out of nowhere, but I don't know, it felt like there was too many ideas in this book all being put together. And it was too much. And then what really took it all the way over the top, and I actually think it was cool. I'll talk about that in a second. I actually think it was all very interesting and cool, but it just felt like, I don't know, that the murder mystery and the romance fit with this commentary on Israel, which is what it seemed like he sort of wanted the book to be. So anyway, so then what happens is they're trying to get rid of the mosque that's, supposedly in the way of like what they're viewing as their holy land. And so they bomb it, right? And so that happens. And then the book sort of ends. This horrible thing happens. They try to tip off the U.S. government, but the U.S. government, sort of already knows about it. They're, in on it. Um, and then that's kind of it. That's the end of the book. So this terrible thing happens. And then they go and try, our main characters who try to stop it sort of walk into uncertainty for the rest of their lives because they don't really know. They're not going to go back to that new Israel, and they don't really know where they're going to go. But they fell back in love, so they have each other, so they feel like it doesn't really matter where they go because they're together. So anyway, just on like a book level, I don't think all those ideas worked together. Shifting gears on the commentary level, I really liked a lot of what this book had to say about Israel. And I also think, so I'm Jewish myself, like 25% Jewish, so not like mostly Jewish, but enough Jewish. But anyway, I really like this concept of like that the main characters come to at the end, which is like the fact that they have each other is enough of a home for them. And there's a lot of Jewish people that really believe that like the homeland is in like their love and solidarity with one another, not in taking things from other people in violent ways. And so I thought that commentary was powerful and important. That being said, I actually think this book was problematic in a lot of ways. One of those ways was I thought it was Islamophobic at parts, especially when they have the bombing of when they bomb the mosque. The bad guys are like, oh, no one's going to know that it was us because they'll just think that it was Muslims bombing each other because they always do that. And everyone else will just kind of buy into that. And I guess you could argue that like that's not what the author's opinion is or what the author's trying to say, but the author's making a commentary on like the Islamophobia of the world and like the fact that that is probably how the world would spin it because the world is Islamophobic. So maybe that's the angle that he was going for, but the way that it was said in the book made it seem like that was reality, which is that they're always fighting, and so they'll probably just think it was each other, and they won't even suspect us. And I'm just sitting here from the reality that the United States and its allies are constantly doing military strikes against people all over the world, right? So, like, why would anybody not think it was the United States and their allies? Like, of course, if there's a major bombing with expensive weapons, it's going to be the countries that have expensive weapons, like the United States. So that kind of bothered me. And then I also think the way that this book treated indigenous people was like a problem too. Now, one of the main characters is half indigenous, and one of the side plots of this book is that he figures out that his mom, who was this indigenous woman, was actually, her death was partially the fault of his own dad, who's Jewish. And so his whole like reckoning with that new realization is like a major part of the book. And again, this book is really about like finding homeland after being kicked out of everywhere, right? And being persecuted everywhere, and like figuring out what even being someplace or having a sense of belonging means, right? And then it's also about colonization and like violent occupation. And so both of those themes are repeated throughout the book. But other than the main other than the main character who I just mentioned, who's half indigenous, the representation of indigenous people makes them just seem like they're just really angry all the time, and violent. And then at the end, it sort of like pushes back against that, but not well enough. And I really don't think that it paints them with like a brush of humanity. I think it really sort of generalized this group of people. And I also think, yeah. So I thought that was a problem. So those two things I thought were an issue. And then what I thought was really interesting is I'm sitting here reading this book and I'm like, this book seems like I see what it's trying to say, and I think what it's trying to say is good, but it seems a little Islamophobic and like a little bit racist against indigenous, indigenous Alaskans. And then I Googled it to see if other people thought that. And everything that came up was other people thinking that this book was offensive, but not offensive for those reasons. It was people thinking this book was anti-Semitic, which I just wasn't expecting, because the whole book is, this book has so many different kinds of Jewish people represented, and it really shows like their full humanity. And there's terrible Jewish people in the book, and there's amazing Jewish people in the book, because that's how reality is, right? Of all people that have ever existed, there's some that are great people, and there's some that are terrible people. And the commentary that this book has is not that, like, Jewish people are bad and would do violence. The commentary is, if anything, almost an atheistic commentary, and also an anti-United States government commentary, an anti-military and anti-colonization commentary, which is just like, when you mix like religious extremism with this, deep need to expand and take things over, and like unmitigated military power, then it's a problem. That's what the book to me was saying. I didn't feel like the book was saying anything about like the nature of Jewish people or their tendency to do something terrible. So I was just surprised by how many people thought it was anti-Semitic. And not that Jewish people can't be anti-Semitic, but Michael Chabon is Jewish. And he writes, I don't even know if I'm saying his name right, but he writes a lot of books about being Jewish and the Jewish experience that he's had. And so I'm just so tired of, you know what it is? I'm just so tired of anytime anybody criticizes Israel, even in very minuscule ways, they're called anti-Semitic, when meanwhile there's actual anti-Semites running wild and killing people. And they don't get nearly as much public outcry from the media, particularly like news media, that anti-Zionists do. So I'm tired of that, as I'm sure many, many, many people are. Anyway, coming back to the book though, I think it had a lot of really cool ideas, and I do think the character development was amazing, but I would not read it. I don't think it was good enough to read. So, yeah, I guess that's all I have to say. I thought this was going to be a shorter video, but I think it ended up being longer. Alright.